My name is Uesifili Unasa. I'm Samoan, born in Samoa, and my parents migrated with my other siblings in the 1970s to Auckland, and grew up in West Auckland and came to Auckland University as a student in the 80s. And straight after the university career, I went into the ministry, went to Samoa to train in the Methodist Theological College there, came to New Zealand and served in parishes in Northland, Dunedin and South Auckland. And now I'm at the University of Auckland as the Maclaurin Chaplain to the university. I was very fortunate and really privileged to be part of the International Visitors Leaders Program, which is sponsored by the United States State Department. And that invited, I think, about 15 or so participants from the Asia Pacific region around the theme of community activism and minority rights. And that took us around 5 states during the latter part of 2011. Well, being a church minister, and particularly being a Methodist minister with its emphasis on social justice and community, my work has really been around how the church interacts and interface in its ministry and mission to the life of community. So I've done that since 1991 when I first began ministry to work amongst communities right across the demographics. So my work in the community in Northland, for example, was around Pākehā rural community and Māori. South Auckland was more around Pacific. Dunedin, again, a different part of the community. But these have been geared towards community empowerment, around building up education for young children in South Auckland, social service delivery in Dunedin and in Auckland. These are integral to what the church mission and values are about. So my work in the church has been very much about building community, supporting community initiative and empowering the people. My more recent work has been around the educational part of the community with the appointment to the Maclaurin Chaplaincy. That's given me another context in which to nurture and support the life of students, their aspirations, their concerns and their challenges, but also around the academic community of the teachers and the administrators and managers of the campus community. Well, all the evidence that's coming out of central government, whether it's health or education, certainly in the political process and decision-making processes, they point to a community that is at the wrong end of progress or aspirational outcomes. And it is very clear that from the research that's evident in the health sector, Pacific people suffer chronic diseases that you will normally find in third world countries, are very much part of our Pacific communities in Auckland, where families have no places to live, they live in overcrowding situation. Normal things that people can treat through their diets have become chronic problems and massive problems health-wise for our Pacific communities. So our health statistics don't look good, and that's evidence in the research and the statistics from the Ministry of Health. You look at our educational achievement, most of our kids struggle to get to good schooling. The schools they do tend to go to because of the lower socio-economic deciles and zones in which they are placed, don't do the subjects or don't have the subjects available that allow our children to go into medicine, to science, to engineering, to the higher technical subjects requirements for university. So from an educational level, the level for us in terms of achievement and the skills that we need to acquire is really at the bottom end. We look at the political process and how Pacific people input into decision making. most of our people are in advisory roles. They are not in key decision-making strategic roles where resources are distributed and key decisions that impact on communities are made. So we look at board of governance right across non-profit organisations or in business and corporate sectors. Very, very, very few Pacific people are there. And even in our representation, whether it's at local government or central government level, there is no Pacific voice that has clout or strength to actually impact the policies of parties or the laws and the acts that come out of Parliament. So we are looking at a marginalised community, not just in terms of the socio-economic, but in terms of the political, but also in terms of the morale of the community. It is a struggling community on the margins of New Zealand society. The first thing I want to say about the program, it was really a privilege to be part of that. And I want to acknowledge the work of the Embassy here and the opportunity to advocate my participation in it. I've said before, the program has been a life-changing opportunity for me. One, because I went to a place that I have long idolised and aspired to know more about, and that is the United States. But some of my childhood heroes came out of the American story, the Martin Luther Kings, the Malcolm X, but also the John Kennedys, and of course the movies and the writers and people who have just risen to a role where they have influenced society in so many different ways. So to go there was a life-changing experience. But more importantly, what I gained from the program was the opportunity to know that things can be done. Martin Luther King standing on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial and speaking to people, and 200,000 plus people marching to Washington are things that have been done, and so it made it real for me. Not just stories in the book, but lives that have actually worked it. So it was important for me to go to the place, to be part of the landscape, to stand on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial and to envision what could be possible here in New Zealand. Some of the more practical steps I learned from there was how to use social media, how to mobilize people through the technology and the information that we can now have at our disposal. So I learned a lot about how to use Facebook, how to use Twitter, how to message key themes of a movement and ideals. That's how Advanced Pasifika came about, was really standing on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial and imagining, why can't we do this in Aotea Square in central Auckland and actually speak to our people about empowering their future? And we did that. The other thing was also about learning how the different advocacies, whether it be voluntary or corporate or government, coming together to a cause. And so visiting the 5 states in the program, from Washington to North Carolina, to Texas, to Hawaii, to San Francisco, I experienced and heard and saw the different elements of community activism coming together through key people to empower a movement and to empower ideas. And so for me it wasn't just at that moral, abstract level that I found meaning in learning, but at the very specific level of grassroots activism and practical action. Well, one thing mentioned just previously is the faith. That's a very powerful core to Pacific people. is this sense that they are not alone, and that divine power, God, however we call this universal power, it's at the core of Pacific community, and that's what drives the community. And I think that's an overpowering factor in terms of the challenges that Pacific people face in New Zealand. So that's the key. It's this sense of the divine, of a greater goal, of a supreme being that empowers people beyond the normal challenges of their lives. We've got a young population, young people who represent not just the present, but the future of what Pacific people can become. And we have successes, not just in the sports field, which we know very well right across the world, but very much in New Zealand and in Auckland. We have burgeoning art community, young people who are moving into the theatres and to the media, to the movies. You know, these greening possibilities for the Pacific community. We look at the basis of our culture. It's strong, you know, we still celebrate that. We try and speak our language, we try and dance, we try and sing. We eat our feasts because that's very much part of us, despite what the doctors say. It's those things that I believe nurtures and strengthens and empowers our communities for a better future, even though we know very well the realities and the shortcomings of where we are at the moment. So I think the Pacific people are very optimistic, and I think they're confident about the future, but they also know what has to be overcome to reach their potential.